Hi there, and good afternoon. My name's Bernie Maloney. I'd like to welcome you to Make New Mistakes, leadership lessons from an Agile success. Now, as we get started, I want to admit I'm really kind of nervous about recording a session, more so than if I was giving a live talk. This is kind of challenging for me. And I've already made a huge mistake. The last time I recorded this, I forgot to turn on the microphone. So really, hopefully I've got it a little bit better this time. As we get started, I really want to be sure that you've got the handout that comes along with this session. It's 2 pages, and the first of the 2 pages, which you should have gotten in a PDF, looks like this. As I talk about the lessons from this leadership success, this Agile success, you're going to have an opportunity to take notes about how they might apply and what steps you'll take when you go back to work to apply what you learn here in this session. Now, as we get started, it'd also really help me and you if you take a moment to write down what you'd like to take away from this session. And I'll give you a minute or so here as I talk through this for you to record that in chat. Writing this down is going to prime your mind for absorbing the lessons that we cover in this session. And as well, if you put it into chat and share it with all the other attendees of this session, it's probably going to expand your awareness of the information so you can absorb even more. So that's a really good idea if you can. Take a moment and write down one takeaway that you'd like to have from this session. As well, I'm going to be watching this with you concurrently, and that's going to help prepare me for what interests you ahead of our live Q&A session at the end. Now, speaking of that live Q&A session, really as we go through this talk in chat as well, please put your questions in there. In aggregate, this is going to give me a picture of what the most valuable stuff is to talk about in our live Q&A session that we have at the end to benefit the whole audience. Okay, that's given us about a minute to record what you want to take away, and you already know that you can record your questions in chat as we go through this session. Let me more formally introduce myself. My name is Bernie Maloney. I'm a certified Scrum trainer and Agile leadership coach. Really, what I do is I help my clients achieve performance breakthroughs with their teams, their organizations, and sometimes even themselves. If you'd like to stay in touch with me, I'll have how to do that at the end of the session. As well, at the bottom of the handout, you'll find a little contact form URL that you can use to reach me, as well as a QR code that takes you to that same URL. Now, let me tell you a little bit about my background in Agile. It started over 20 years ago in a hardware software division at HP called Consumer PCs, where we had a 14-month development cycle for things like sheet metal, but only a 3-month shelf life for what we could ship for our products. We started out when I joined shipping only 6 products a quarter, which grew to 20 products a quarter in the US. And by the time I left that division after about 8 years, to 200 products a quarter in Europe alone. When I started, we were a break-even business. We grew that to a $1 billion a quarter business, all with weekly iterations of the plan. Now, one key thing to know about that consumer PC business is while you've got a 3-month shelf life and that really long lead time, if you miss that first week of on ad for sales, you don't just miss 1/12 of your addressable market, you actually miss more like about 1/3. So it was a very schedule-driven, kind of risky business because the margins were under 10% for most of our SKUs. Now, one of the reasons that this division was really successful, in fact, it was the fastest division in HP's history to hit $1 billion, was a mindset element that was there. And throughout the division from its founding, there was a philosophy of make new mistakes. People knew that there were going to be razor thin margins, mistakes were going to be inevitable, and so long as we got the lessons, we were going to be okay. Even to the point of one of the stories I'm going to tell you for a leadership lesson was I made $1 million mistake in that business and was forgiven. See, one thing to keep in mind is Agile's kind of like an onion. There are tools and processes and practices, and those can be run in command and control. They're really visible, but they're not so valuable. You can get outside of that to values and principles, and that starts to require some culture change in the organization. But it really isn't until you get out to mindset. And at that outer layer, those things are not very visible, but they're the most valuable things. When you start to shift that mindset, that's where you get a resilient learning organization. And that's what we're going to talk about here, those leadership lessons that help to set that mindset embodied and make new mistakes. So let's step in and get that first leadership lesson. And that's to start with a purpose, a really clear why for your organization. Now, when I joined that division at HP, it was a number 5 vendor in the consumer PC space and had aspirations to get to number 1. The way that we captured that clear purpose was beat Compaq, because Compaq at that point was a separate company and was the number 1 vendor in the space. That became a rallying cry that gave the entire organization a framework in which they could make decisions. See, when you start with Agile, you're probably going to start working in the business. This is working on the tools and the practices and the processes. And that's really the way that a lot of Agile comes in, where it's a focus on the operation, but that's missing some of the benefits. So as any business grows or as Agile grows, what happens for that business is the vision for it and the themes start to expand to a much higher level. You've got to move out of operation and into anticipation. And you see this in Agile when you've really got good product roadmaps and you're starting to plan releases to be able to hit things on time. So when you get into this phase, it's really key to start giving your teams a really clear why, because that gives them a framework that they can aim at, that they can make decisions that are consistent with that business purpose overall. Now, the importance of this is really illustrated in Simon Sinek's talk, Start With Why, where he talks about Dr. Martin Luther King. And he points out that, look, Dr. King got, 300,000, a million people, right place, right time, right date. Now, this is pre-internet, pre-fax, pre-cheap telephone calls. And how did he do it? Well, really, kind of the key point here is Dr. King gave the I have a dream speech, not the I have a plan speech. So people came for the dream, for themselves, not for the plan. When you give people a dream, when you give them a really clear why, they're going to work with their blood, their sweat, and their tears to achieve that because they've really got that sense of purpose. If you only give them a plan, they're going to work for a paycheck. So now I'll give you about 30 seconds with that handout and look at the first part of that and see if you can articulate what your current organization's why is. Is it clear? And if it's not, who at work are you going to talk to seek it out and maybe start to drive some clarity in that organization so that people can really feel that emotional engagement overall? Go ahead and take a few seconds to take those notes. Okay, so now let's step into that second leadership lesson. And that's really to focus on having stable teams. So in that business at HP, when we were going through manufacturing ramp one time, we'd already built the first 200 units and we were about to go into volume production. When we discovered our competition had a key feature, it was the amount of memory in the PCs that had twice as much the capacity, meaning they were going to deliver twice as much the value at that point. And we all recognized what that meant. It meant that we were about to begin shipping bricks. That is something that's worthless that we wouldn't be able to recover the costs on. In fact, we'd be better served to reduce our margins and put that memory in. But that meant a huge and very rapid pivot. The organization, because everybody was in stable teams, knew exactly how the pieces were going to fit together, so the handoffs were really smooth. We quarantined those 200 units. We started to pull in additional memory from our stocks and put those memory sticks into the memory slots in the motherboards. And we also went and backfilled all of the orders for memory so that we could continue production with the volume of the SKU. That pivot was really successful because we had stable teams who knew what was going on and how the pieces fit together. So this illustrates another point. See, teams are not groups of people who work together. They're really groups of people who trust each other. This is illustrated in American football by, okay, who's the highest paid player on an American football team? But then reflect on who the second highest paid player is on an American football team. It's the blind side tackle, because that position is responsible for protecting the quarterback in the game overall. That's a really high degree of trust that you need to build with your organization. So something to keep in mind about teams. Many project managers have heard Bruce Tuckman's language of forming, storming, norming, and performing. And when Agile gets introduced into an organization, that's a formation event, and leadership wants it to get to performing really fast. Now, I like to draw this curve, a Satir curve. Both Virginia Satir and Bruce Tuckman were contemporaneous psychologists who kind of came at the problem the same way. They just had slightly different articulations of it. The Satir curve illustrates that anytime you have that formation event, your performance is going to degrade. And this is as simple as taking one team member from Team A and put them on Team B. Both Team A and Team B are going to be having some performance degradation because of that. It might be even minor. When you bring Agile into an organization, the same things happen. Is like you're forming new teams, you're bringing in new ideas. Performance is going to go down before it goes up. A key thing in Agile that you want to focus on is, instead of moving specialists with specialized knowledge to the work, you actually want to move the work to the stable teams, because that reduces the human switching cost of this form, storm, norm curve with both of those teams. The work doesn't have that switching cost. So now take about 30 seconds and reflect on the worksheet. What would you rate your current team's stability in your organization overall? Just give it a high, medium, low rating that's there. And then back at work, who are you going to engage with in having a discussion about the impact of this switching cost? Go ahead, I'll give you a few more seconds to take those notes and have a little bit of reflection. Now, let's step into the third lesson, which is to add support and grow your leadership style. So in that division at HP, I had tactical responsibility for the delivery of $1 billion a quarter product line, but I had no direct reports. It was kind of a unique position. And one year, my boss came and was it was evaluation time, and he'd gotten some evaluation feedback for me from two different folks on my teams, and both of them effectively said, if Bernie's here a year from now, I won't be. That was really kind of serious. That told me my leadership style wasn't appropriate and I needed to make some adjustments. Luckily, I found this next concept, and it probably saved my career, and it certainly started me on a path to servant leadership. Now, that concept is something called situational leadership, and it talks about leadership having two dimensions, one of increasing direction and another of increasing support. See, when somebody starts out, it's okay to have high direction, and that's what I do. I tell people what to do when they join the division. And then over time, as I saw that they kind of knew what they were doing, I'd back off on direction. This is really kind of natural. But then we weren't getting the results that were needed for us to stay on track, and I'd go back out into high direction. And folks find that insulting. So really, this is where you got to add support as a dimension. And one way of thinking about this is, when people start out, they're really high confidence. Woohoo, they just got hired, but they may be low competence and they need that direction. Like a kid joining a little league team. Woohoo, I made the team, but they've never played the game as an organized sport before. It's really appropriate for their baseball coach to say something like, great, okay, go run 10 laps. Super high direction. Now over time, that same kid is going to build some competence in playing the game, and they're going to know it. And what happens is they might go, coach, I'm just not able to hit the ball. Help me out here. And the coach will say, you're doing fine. A little bit of support. They're going to move from direction into coaching as a quadrant. So from direction, they go, you're doing fine. That's some support. Give me 10 push-ups because that's going to increase your arm strength so you can get the bat around faster and have a higher chance of making a hit. Now, over time, you got to move from coaching and over into what situational leadership calls mentoring or supporting. And you can kind of think of this as, coach, when I'm pitching, I'm not getting the moves down for picking the player off when they're on first base. And the discussion's a little bit different where the coach might say something like, well, when I played the game. It's a little bit more of an advice and mentoring sort of a conversation. And it isn't until you get people past that point that you can actually get them all the way to the point where you can do high delegation and just let them go. See, when folks start out, direction is really an okay leadership style. But over time, you move from I talk, I decide, very leader directed, to we talk, I decide, still leader directed, to shifting over to we talk, you decide, to finally you decide, I trust you. What this does with your followers is it shifts them from a focus on task and output towards a focus on outcome. This is a very conscious thing that you should be doing as a leadership style because our goal in Agile is actually to have self-directed teams. Now, many technology managers are super familiar with this directive style, and we all see instances where the manager backs off but then comes in and as Agile's there, they kind of become a micromanager. A good thing to think about here is something that Rajiv Peshawaria points out in Too Many Bosses, Too Few Leaders. And what he says there is, when you're a first line manager, you can still do the work of the team and you can still kind of focus on that. But when you become a second level manager, you've actually got to let go of it. And that's really, really hard. Now, it's also really hard because Peshawaria points out there are no established frameworks or mentors or practices to help people learn that second level management skill of letting go. Now, what does Agile do when you bring it into an organization? Your goal is to have self-directed teams, and those first-line managers all of a sudden go, wait, what am I supposed to do? And that's where they might jump into micromanagement. Instead, what I like to do with them is, because those self-directed teams force managers to let go, I like to have conversations with them about how they need to grow their coaching and mentoring skills. And here's the beautiful thing. They get to move into a more strategic and anticipatory way of working with the organization and with their teams, where they're starting to create a space for those teams to succeed. So now, take about 30 seconds with your worksheet and ask yourself, where's your current leadership style on this spectrum? What steps are you going to take to grow it for yourself? What steps are you going to take to grow it for your organization? Go ahead and take a few more seconds to take some notes on that worksheet. Okay, now let's step into the next leadership lesson, and that's to enable your self-directed teams by clarifying their decision-making authority. Now, in that division at HP, I had that tactical responsibility for the delivery of $1 billion quarter product line, and we had really tight deadlines, timelines for being able to meet our release dates, and really high implications of not meeting our release dates. We hit one Friday afternoon as we were in our development cycle for the release. We were at a key transition point in one of the technologies. For us to be able to have the new technology in play, like marketing had been saying, was needed for the upcoming release, we needed to make a component buy. And if we made the wrong decision, it would be $1 million mistake, and we'd know that really shortly. Well, there was nobody in leadership around, nobody in management above me. I was positionally the person that everybody had to go to. And knowing both that I was the position to go to, and we had an ethic in the organization of both keeping that timeline and that mindset of making new mistakes, I said, go ahead and make the component buy. It was the wrong decision. We found out on Monday morning, no, okay, we could probably survive. That transition was not going to be something that our competitors were going to be able to make. And so we were able to sell the components back, but take $1 million hit. We did have a retrospective. It was not a comfortable conversation with the general manager. But because of that mindset, I can still hear his words ringing in my ears as we wrapped up that retrospective. And he said, well, let's make new mistakes next time. And really, that's kind of the key lesson here is I knew that I had that decision-making authority, and it also illustrates one of the lessons that you want to apply in Agile, and that's get the fundamentals solid in Agile and build trust with your teams. Rather than making the decisions for them, show them how to make the decisions that would be consistent with what you think is needed. And then recognize them for applying the values that we see in Scrum of courage and focus when things go a little bit sideways. Because you've now created some psychological safety for those teams by not only self-directing, helping them with self-direction by showing them how to make the decisions, but also supporting their courage and focus to make a new mistake. Now, one of the ways that you can clarify decision making, you may have already heard of, is something called a RACI or a DACI matrix. So that's an acronym, and the R stands for responsible, the A for accountable, which is the single hand to shake, the C is for consulted, who kind of influences things, and the I is for informed. These are the people who just need to know the information. So that's RACI. You may have also heard DACI, which just applies slightly different terms. I'm going to keep the colors the same here on the diagram. It applies slightly different terms to a couple of the positions. So keep that in mind whether you're using RACI or DACI as a term. So in a lot of situations, typically you're going to find these four aspects all jumbled up, and ideally you'd really like to get them separated as much as possible. Practically, what you can do by setting up a RACI or DACI matrix is get some minor overlap between most of them, and the thing you really want to focus on is making sure that the folks who are merely informed about the decision know that, great, it's nice that you have opinions, but you're just going to be informed. It's only the consulted folks, and sometimes those consulted folks are actually your leadership in an Agile organization. So let me show you an example. Here's one right out of that division for all the roles down the left, and then all the phases that we went through in development of a PC release cycle. So things like concept gate review, investigation gate review, design gate review, release to QA, which in software terms you might think of as functionally complete, manufacturing release, first customer ship, end of life, and end of service life are illustrated on this chart. Now, here's another strong parallel. See, I live and work in Silicon Valley, and this is something that I like to ask folks. You can see the stage gates that are here, but for startups in general, which Silicon Valley is known from, do you think of them as stage gate waterfall or Agile? Well, really, have you ever heard of funding rounds in startups? See, funding rounds really are stage gates for startups where the startup is funded to get to the next stage gate to go explore things. And that's what we did in this hardware division, is those gate reviews were investigations where we made the best decision that we possibly could at the last responsible moment. And then that set the plan up until the next gate review. Within those gate reviews, the teams operated in an agile fashion, and they knew their decision-making authority as they went for each gate review. Another way that you can set your teams up for structures and clear decision-making comes to us from Jürgen Appelo, and he talks about delegation boards, and he talks about a spectrum of the way that we might interact with teams, from telling really clear direction to more kind of collaborative discussions in the middle to full delegation at the other side of the spectrum overall. One of the ways that you can clarify decision making with your teams is to set up a delegation board where you talk about the common decisions that you're making in the organization, and you make it clear what the team can decide for themselves, where they need to talk to leadership, and where leadership is just going to kind of put things down. So an example might be, well, the teams can pick any name they like, but we're going to dial that back just a little bit so long as there's no profanity. That's a really reasonable thing to put in as a delegation to the team but also a little bit of a constraint that dials it back from full delegation. So that might be where there's a consult or an agree sort of a phrase. Now, on your worksheet, I'm going to give you about 60 seconds here. On page 2, uh, there's a matrix. Think of 3 common decisions that occur in your organization and mark an X for the current state in your organization and an O for where you'd like the desired state to be. And then think how you'll share this structure when you get back at work and maybe who you'll have that conversation with. Go ahead. I'll give you 10 or 15 more seconds to take some notes on that, on some of the common decisions, where they are now, where you'd like them to be for clarity, and who you're going to talk about this with when you get back to work. Okay, let's step into the 5th leadership lesson, and that is to see the whole of your organization and to evolve it by design rather than by default. So in that division, when we were small, we did our manufacturing ramps with a step function where we go from 0 to thousands of units of manufacture across multiple models within a single week. And as we grew, both in terms of the number of models that we were producing and the volume that we were producing, that was leading to thrash because manufacturing had to ramp down a whole bunch and then ramp up a whole bunch more. And that's really hard to do at volume and with complexity. So we really recognized that in our race to produce new products, to develop new things, we lost sight of the whole of the way that we were producing our value chain. Now, that's really kind of common in organizations, that they evolve by default rather than by design. A lot of organizations, and both the Founders Institute and the Startup Genome Project, now known as Compass.co, kind of pointed this out, that a lot of startups start up with 2 founders, one that's focused on marketing, one that's focused on technology. And then as they grow over time, more functions come in because they've got more specializations that they're really going to need to apply. And over time, they've got a little bit more and it gets larger. And really, as you get there, coordinating all of this is very, very complex for an organization. So still, those organizations really have that kind of 2-pronged way of operating, of marketing and engineering, or marketing and technology. And what you really want to do is scale your organization by abstracting the patterns that are there underneath, rather than adopting kind of that pattern that was there at the very beginning, where you had probably a founder focused on technology and another founder focused on marketing. You want to start recognizing that that's appropriate for a start dimension. But when you get big and you've shipped your first product or you've got ongoing things, there's also a run dimension. And this is something that a lot of startups really don't recognize at the beginning, that they're eventually going to need to run the business. And because of that, it's really wise, and this is what the clouds illustrate, to not go for really the functional specialist in one particular corner. You're going to want some range players in your teams so that they can cross over in these various domains. Now, as well, and you're looking at this overall, seeing the whole by applying that lean principle of the organization. Also recognize that there are general and administrative functions in your organization. Those are illustrated on the right of this diagram and on your handout. These are typical areas in your organization like finance and legal and human relations. Now, this illustrates kind of an interesting thing, because in a lot of startups, the COO of an organization comes out of finance or legal quite often. But let's take a step back and kind of look at those G&A functions. Why does an organization have human relations? Well, it's honestly to keep the organization from getting sued by the employees, frankly. Why is there finance? Well, we've got financial reporting laws that we've got to comply with. And well, why do we have legal? Legal. You can kind of look at that and recognize those are really defensive-minded positions on your team versus the other ones in the bubbles that you see here. That's kind of the offensive part of your team. The ones that score the points, that deliver value, that make things out, where G&A is defensive and make sure that the organization is safe, sane, and stable. Now, let's also take a look at typical project management. What does project management concern itself a lot with? Well, hey, what's our statement of work? That's really kind of a legal question. What's our staffing for this project? That's kind of an HR question. What's our accrued value? That's kind of a finance question. So that fourth bubble in this diagram, that's really kind of where PMOs fit. And there's still a role for project managers in Agile, but recognize that that mindset approach is really kind of a defensive mindset versus Agile is kind of an offensive mindset. And you want to have a balance between the two. It's not to say that there's no role for project managers in Agile. It's just that they're really good at chartering and reporting out and being a buffer for all of those things that we need to keep an organization safe, sane, stable, and healthy. So by taking a step back from the organization overall and seeing the whole, back in that HP division, we were able to see the impact of really producing new things onto our operations. And for me, that operations area, that was manufacturing, versus in a lot of software, that's the IT area. And now we kind of think of that as DevOps. Really, you want to take that whole picture. And when we did, we looked at a balance of the organization overall. And instead of doing those step function ramps, what we started to do was we started to go at the margins at our high and our low price points. And we changed those out to the new models. And there was kind of a balance in volume as we got all the way down to our mid price point as we did it, so that there was a much smoother set of transitions in operations for that organization. So you want to take a look at your overall organization. So pick up your handout and I'll talk you through this. Think of the various functions or groups or teams in your organization and where they might fit on this bubble diagram in your handout. Just go ahead and write some of them in. So map those teams in your organization on there. And circle any of the areas that you see where there's no coverage, where you've got some gaps, and that might point you to some of the problems that you're having in the organization. Put a box around places where there's a recognized problem, maybe with a particular team or with a particular gap in the organization. And then think, how are you going to cross-check your perspective when you get back to work? And as well, how are you going to apply this model to either close a gap or address a problem? Go ahead and take about 10 more seconds to wrap up your note-taking. Okay, let's go ahead and summarize these leadership lessons that we've gone over. And I'm probably going to throw in a sixth leadership lesson that came up to me as I was doing this recording. Because, see, it's not so much about the doing the Agile. Really what you want to do is shift the mindset and shift the being Agile in your organization. So the first of those lessons is that you want to start with purpose, a really clear why for your organization overall, because that gives folks a way to steer towards delivering the most value they can for the organization so that you can all win. We see this in microcosm in Scrum, where every sprint should have a goal. Really, it says that directly in the Scrum Guide. That's one of the ways that you can improve the performance of your teams, is be sure that every sprint has a goal. See, great leaders give us something to believe in rather than something to do. Remember, if you give people something to believe in, they'll probably work with their blood, their sweat, and their tears versus working for a paycheck if you only give them something to do. So a key for high-performing teams and the leadership lesson is to give your teams a very clear why. Okay, next leadership lesson, you want to have stable teams. Remember, people go through a switching cost of forming, storming, norming, performing. This is just normal human behavior. So if you're moving people to work and switching them between teams, you're actually degrading performance on both teams. Instead, have stable teams and steer the work to the teams versus the people, to the work. Now, as you do that, also grow your own leadership style. See, you want to move from a directive leadership style to a delegative leadership style. And to do that, you've got to add a dimension of support. You've got to make things safe for your teams and make it really clear for them how to make decisions that are consistent with what you'd like as a leader. And as you do that, they're going to step up, but you're going to have to praise them for applying courage and focus, even if they make some of those survivable mistakes, because they can get those lessons learned. Okay, to do that, it really helps to clarify what their self-directed decision-making authority is. And you can do this pretty simply with a couple of techniques. Something like delegation boards for where the team knows that they can make the decision on their own versus where they've got to talk to each other, or a racy-daisy matrix that really outlines who's got the accountability at any point in time in your development cycle. Both of these are ways for a team to know what they can decide on their own. Now, that fifth lesson is you really want to see the whole. Apply that lean principle and see the whole of your organization. Recognize both the offensive as well as the defensive positions that go into your organization. Recognize the difference between starting and creating new stuff and running new stuff. And as you're building out your organization, don't go just for the specific key, really hot skill. You're going to need to have some range players that are in there that ideally understand the other aspects of the whole organization so that they can make appropriate compromises and really be collaborative. Because remember, great leaders give us something to believe in rather than something to do. Okay, that was the 5 lessons that I explicitly went over. Let me give you a 6th lesson. Recall back at the very beginning of this recording where I mentioned that I was nervous about doing the recording. I still have been. And also that the last time I made the recording, I made a huge mistake and forgot to turn on the audio. I think I got that right this time. What I did as a leader leading this session was I introduced some vulnerability to me as a leader. And what that does to your team when you introduce some vulnerability is it allows your team to step up behind and really pull through for you. So make yourself a human being as a leader. Indicate some vulnerability and let your team fill in that space. You don't have to have all of the answers. You actually can show some of that vulnerability, and that's really going to help your self-directed teams, and it's really going to help your Agile success overall. Because at the bottom line, it really is all about mindset. It's not just the tools, the practices, and the processes. You really want to grow your organization out through the values and principles and towards the mindset. It's the least easily seen, least visible stuff, but it's probably the most valuable. And it's when you get out there that you truly have a resilient learning organization that actually can thrive even in these really emergent environments that we find ourselves in this year. So with that, I like to remind the organizations that I work with that doing Agile appears easy, and it is. Really, those tools and practices, they can be adopted pretty quickly. You can learn them in a 2-day class like I teach, or you can read the Scrum Guide. But that's not where the juice is. Really, you want to shift to being Agile, and that is going to take some discipline and some courage. So make the space for your teams to be able to do that. Now, as we wrap up this recording, in the chat, I'd really love to know what some of your ahas, some of your takeaways are from this session. And as you share that out with folks, everybody's going to get some shared understanding and maybe reinforce some of the points that you caught that they didn't. Remember as well that I'm watching that chat concurrently with you while this recording is playing in preparation for the Q&A session that we're about to start into. Now, if we don't have enough time for that Q&A session, I want to be sure that you have an opportunity to stay in touch with me. And you can do that with the QR code or the URL that I've got here. You can bring out your QR code reader. It'll take you to the same URL of bit.ly/contact Bernie. It's a short little contact form. So if you want to reach out to me even after our Q&A session, this is the way to do it. With that, I'd like to say thank you very much for your attention. My name's Bernie Maloney. I'm an Agile leadership coach. And really, my purpose is to help my clients accelerate the genius that may lie untapped in their organizations. I do that by helping them make performance breakthroughs with their teams, their organizations, and sometimes even themselves. It really is a thrill to talk even on this recording, because that's one way of spreading that mission of mine of accelerating genius. And with that, we're kind of wrapped up on the formal presentation. I do want to remind you that it is really all about mindset. And let's stay in touch while we take Q&A now. Thanks.